Hello everybody, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to do a tag. Jack, my good friend from Spread Book Joy, and her information will be down below, created an original tag. Or is that an oxymoron if you create and it's original? But her tag is called the Evolution of a Reader tag. And it has 4 questions. And I was really moved to do this tag because I have 8 decades of evolution or growth in my reading. By the way, I'm Marilyn Maya, and please subscribe to my channel and welcome if you're new. Let's go on to the questions first. The first question is what you read. So there's 4 questions. What you read. How has your taste in books evolved? That is a good question, and it would be a long question because like I said, I have 8 decades of evolution. So when I first heard this question, I realized that I had a lot to say about it because the way I started reading at a very young age, and Jack was talking about that she was brought up in a house of readers. I was brought up just my mother reading, and reading was very important. I was taught how to read before I was even out of diapers, I think. And I was out of diapers early, my mother tells me. So I started reading first for enjoyment because my mother read to me the little golden books. And then I read as an escape. I would go to the library and I would be stuck in the fairy tale section. And I always say that maybe that's the reason that I don't like fantasy that much now as an adult, because I really read every single Grimm's fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen, all kinds of rhymes and English fairy tales, you name it, I read it before I was 8. So then I read for learning, because think of it, there was no Google. Now you can just say, Google, what do I do for this? Google, what do I do for that? Google, how do you do this? How do you do that? What did you do in the 50s and 60s? You had to actually go and research it yourself. It took time. I didn't even have an encyclopedia growing up. So we went to the library and we learned how to do it for ourselves. We were the Google. So I started out being a very shy girl, so I went to read How to Be Popular. That was if I was going to Google that, I would, well, there was no Google, there was no computers in the 50s. So I would look at the books, the nonfiction, and that's why nonfiction is such an important part of my life, or has been, though it's changing. And I'll get to that in another question. So I married at a young age, knowing nothing. I was 18. I had my first child at 18. So I read nonfiction, and some of the books that I read I don't know if they're relevant anymore, but one was Pregnancy Without Fear: The Principles and Practice of Natural Childbirth by Grantley Dick Reed. And this was published for the first around the 1940s, and during the 60s it was still around. I think it was in a new edition by that time. So you know, natural childbirth was a new thing in the 60s and 70s. So I had a lot of fear. So I didn't know anything about giving birth, or, you know, my mother never really spoke about the birds and the bees, as we used to call it, or sex. So I didn't know anything. So I went to the library and I read that book, and that was like my Bible during my 9 months, because it taught me, you know, I think there's another book that is like in the 70s, Your Body, or and Yourself, and there's another book about pregnancy that is very popular. But then I didn't know how to clean the house. So I don't know if any of you oldsters remember Heloise, but she had a book, How to Clean House, Heloise's Housekeeping Hints, and that was published in '65, and that wasn't as interested as I was in Pregnancy Without Fear, but it shows how nonfiction was like our Google. And then I wanted to travel, so yeah, I really looked at that 914 in the Dewey Decimal System at the library, and there was a book called, and I think I mentioned this before, and it was How to Travel Without Money. Well, actually, it wasn't called that. It was Froma's Europe on $5 a day. Basically, how to travel without money. And that and the Railway Guide to Europe became sort of my go-tos for imaginary armchair travel. But I always had it in my mind that I was going to travel. So that was my Google for that, or my non-Google for that. Then, I'm not going to talk about this too much, but it took up a lot of books that I actually bought, and that's weight loss. How to lose weight. There was the Atkins, the Stillman, you name it, they had it. And I tried it all, which I really regret right now doing, because I wasn't, it just gave me a lifelong, burden of that I was fat, even when I wasn't. So yeah, I hate all those diet books, but I have to put that's something that I did. And then because I was anxious about weight and other things, and this book is still around. It's Hope and Help for Your Nerves by Claire Weeks, and she was sort of the guru during that time about anxiety help. So here I'm talking about nonfiction, and also in my nonfiction canon, so to speak, was what questions. What was the Holocaust? So I bought and took out a lot of Holocaust memoirs, because that was part of my family, so I wanted to learn about it, and my mother had forbade me to read any Holocaust or talk about it, and that was a very Jewish thing, in during that time, that they didn't want to talk about it, even though they weren't, their parents are the ones who really went through it. But I was curious. I was always curious, so I started reading, and so I still have a collection of Holocaust memoirs. Then in my 30s, I started reading Jane Austen. So that was a change. So I went from nonfiction to fiction, but a certain kind of fiction, a feel-good Victorian fiction. And I read all of Jane Austen during my 30s. And that really helped. It was also escapism, because I was going through a lot during that time. So now we get to my late 30s, where I went back to college, and I started reading more about women's studies, African American authors. I took a lot of classes on African American history and memoirs, and I remember reading James Baldwin for the first time, and also reading LGBTQA plus material. So that was my college years. Okay, so I think I've talked enough about that question, because more of this is coming up in another question. So number 2, how you read. And this is a fast one. Has the format of your reading changed much? Now, by format, I'm assuming audio versus Kindle versus paper, or any kind of e-reading. And I have to say that it's changed only a little bit. and I still prefer paper books to anything else. I have a Kindle since last year, and I've read a few books on my Kindle. I'm not saying that it's not, it wasn't an enjoyable experience for the few books that I've read. Very handy when you're outside, especially in Hawaii, where you don't want to get the book, especially if it's a library book, you don't want to get it full of sand or water, or, you know, even the air in Hawaii has salt, which wrecks books too. So I do read on my Kindle, but I find I am not collecting books on my Kindle. I read it, but, you know, in a very small way. As for audio, and I really want to get into audio, but every time I listen to an audiobook, I fall asleep. Someone mentioned on Booktube that try to be doing something else while you're listening to the book, and that nonfiction is particularly good for this. But I like my nonfiction to be read. I'm that type of reader. I want to look at the words and not be told a story. If I'm told a story, it affects me in a different way. I'm not using my imagination as much as listening to what the narrator is telling me from the voice, if that makes any sense. So yeah, it hasn't changed much. Number 3, how much you read. Do you read more, less than previously? When do you read? How often you read changed? Well, it has. I think I'm reading much more than I've ever read, because I'm a creator on Booktube, and we always want material to read. While before, I read only because I wanted to. So I can't really say if I'm reading more. I assume I'm reading more. Last year, I read over 100 books. This year, slightly less, and it's not the end of the year. I think I'm up to 60. So I never made any kind of record of how much I read before. I just read constantly. I was always going to the library, but I never read 2 or 3 books at a time, ever. Now I am. So I'm assuming that I'm reading more than previously. When do I read? That has changed. I read at night mostly, where before I would read during the day, and now I find, believe it or not, even though I don't have a full-time job, I'm busier than I was before. So, and I have an animal who happens to be ill right now. So, yeah, hopes and prayers for my Princessa Jasmine out there. She had a seizure yesterday, and yeah, I'm really worried about her. So we took her to the emergency yesterday, and she's resting now. But yeah, so of course I'm looking at all my books and Google about how to take care of a dog who's sick. So the other question was, has how often you read changed? I think I've answered that. I think I'm reading more, but differently, and that's in another question. And the other question, in question 4, how has Booktube changed you as a reader? Oh boy, it's changed me as a reader. And I just mentioned it before that I read more than 1 book at a time. So that has changed me. Jack mentioned that she never had joined book clubs before. And I joined a few book clubs, but I never really found a group that I clicked with. And I always said, or I said in my first memoir, that it's not that I don't like groups, it's that groups didn't like me. But yeah, I just never found that click. And here on Booktube, I'm finding people that have become so dear to me, such close friends, that I consider them like some of my closest friends. So that is how Booktube changed me as a reader. So how else has Booktube changed me as a reader? So we have reading groups on Booktube. We do buddy reads. and I've done a few buddy reads. I don't overextend myself. Jack was talking about how she overextended herself and that Booktube is a pros and cons. I also have pros and cons to Booktube, but I don't overextend myself because I kind of know my limitations. But I try to keep my Booktube buddy reads, and this is not only other Booktubers, but subscribers. And I'm looking forward to having a buddy read with a subscriber next month. So that's going to be a new experience for me. But I find that having these Booktube experience, buddy reads experience, have exposed me to other people's thoughts and other people's, where they're coming from, their origins, come with different perspectives. And that has grown, I have seen great growth as in myself as a reader because of that. Another way that Booktube has changed my reading is I never knew about prizes before. I mean, I knew the Nobel Peace Prize, the Pulitzer Prize. I knew the names, but I never sought out. I never heard of Booker Prize. I never heard of all these prizes. And now, because of Booktube, it's exposed me to a lot of different kinds of literature that I wouldn't normally even know about than read. And of course, other things is recommendations from other Booktubers of books that sound so interesting. I have to go and buy them or get them out of my library. So I wanted to talk about some books that I never would have been exposed to if it wasn't for Booktube, and also that I wouldn't think I would like. The first book I want to talk about did win the Pulitzer Prize, and it's called The Netanyahus. And I'm almost finished with this. It's by Joshua Cohen, and it's an account of a minor and ultimately even negligible episode in the history of a very famous family. And if you look at the book cover, it has a lot of snow and an old car. Looks like it's stuck in the snow. This book has been described to me as hilarious, yet talking about different perspectives in books. Because I have a somewhat Jewish background, because my mother was Jewish, my father was Puerto Rican, but I know a lot about Jewish people because they're my family. So what people thought was really hilarious, I thought was, yeah, that's normal, I know that. Yeah, that's what they say. That's what we do. It's a little bit overblown, but yeah, that was normal to me. But what is so special about this book, and I'm not going to review this book right now, but it has so much more than just hilarity in it. It's a book about philosophy. It's a book about religion. It's a book about Judaism. It's a book about, anti-Semitism. It's a book about a family. It is so much in this book. And I think I would never have read this book because I would have thought it was too dense for me, that I wasn't really smart enough to read a book like this, no matter if I was a teacher, no matter if I had 4 years of college. I thought it wouldn't be enjoyable. And there are some parts that I have to read again, some chapters. And he's a genius, this guy, this author, because he disperses the dense chapters with very light hilarity. So yeah, I think this is going to be one of my top 10 books of the year, but it's going to take me a while, and I have till November 1st, so I'm giving this a lot of time. The second book I want to talk about is an author that I never would have known about if it wasn't for Booktube. Sean the Book Maniac got me hooked on Cora Sandel, who was a Norwegian writer, translated fiction. Even though she was very popular in her time in Norway, she was not popular in English-speaking countries until, I'm not sure if it was 60s, 70s. So I never would have, I've been reading the trilogy of Alberta and Jacob. But today I'm going to talk about another book, and it has a wonderful cover on it, and it's by the Women's Press Fiction, and it's Cora Sandel's Crane's Cafe. And I want to show you the cover first because it's just delightful. It's like women who are cleaning the tables in a cafe. It's called Crane's Cafe. And this was one of her latter books. One thing I wanted to say about this book, and I'm going to read it eventually with Lindy from Lindy's Magpie Reads, who I'm also tagging for this video. But Cora Sandel said that she liked this book the best of all her books. I always love when an author says that, even if it's not true. Sometimes they just say this about their the latest book that they've written, but I tend to believe Cora Sandel because of what I've read so far of her. So so how have I changed? In short, I've changed in every way a reader can change, I think, because I've gone through 8 decades of reading. This is my 8th decade, and I still love reading. I love it even more since I've joined Booktube because I'm expanding. I'm just learning so much more. You're never too old to learn something new. And also, I'm making friends. And a lot of people that get to the age, in their 70s, if they find it hard to make friends. But I was always a very eager, I was an only child of my mother and father, so I was always eager to make new friends and to learn. And I think that's where I've grown as a reader. So the next question, or the next prompt, I should have said, is to tag people. And I'm going to tag just a few that I didn't see on the channel, on her channel, on her video, on Jack's video. So I'm tagging some people who are a little older, not as old as me perhaps, but older than the average booktuber. So I'm going to tag Roz at Scalladandling about the books. She's just a nice person, as well as being a very smart person. And I think that I'll, learn more about her from this tag. And then I'm going to tag Kim at Middle of the Book March, because I'm starting Middlemarch at the end of this month, which is now the end of the month. And of course Lindy at Lindy's Magpie Reads, because we're going through a lot of Cora Sandel together. So thank you so much for watching, and please give some thought to my sick dog. She's 15, and she means the world to me. So any good vibes, leave them down below. And I hope I have some good news in my next video that she's doing better. There was nothing wrong with her according to tests, but she did have, after we came home from, like I said, from the emergency room, she had a seizure. So she's not eating, and she's just laying around. So I'm going to try to take her for a walk today. So thank you so much. I love you all. I depend on you all. And for my social life, I think there's a Booktube channel called Books on My Social Life. I get it. I really get it. So until the next video, which will be, a more bookish type of video with wrap-ups and so on, I wish you all stay well, be kind, and I wish everything that your heart desires. Until we meet again, aloha.